you very much, Samuel. Thank you for inviting me. I'm currently on a sabbatical at the Swiss Ornithological Institute. So Ellie only asked me last week if I'd give the talk, and the beauty of being on a sabbatical is yes, absolutely. I've got nothing in my diary. I can do this next week, no problem. So that's one of the nice benefits of being on sabbatical. So today I'm going to talk to you about something that those of us that work on animal navigation, and particularly, it's particularly relevant to bird migration, something we call true navigation. So what do we mean by true navigation? So true navigation is a global mechanism for a global phenomenon. That's the catchy title I've put on this slide. True navigation, it's something that has a history in of its own right, because people have been interested in bird navigation. I keep wanting to say 50 years, but I've aged 20 years since I first said that. So we've got to talk about now 70 or so years. People have been working on doing research on bird navigation for, I'm sure, much longer, but formally since the 1950s. And it was the biologist Don Griffin, and you mentioned that there are bat people amongst us. Don Griffin is very famous for being one of the person who really nailed down our understanding of how bats use echolocation to navigate their surroundings. But Don Griffin, alongside this, was also one of the pioneers of understanding how birds navigate, and he did this mainly through observing the behavior of homing pigeons, and we'll come back to those homing pigeons later. And he laid down some initial formalization of the types of navigation he observed in his homing pigeons. And there were several types, one of which he called type 3 navigation. And this was something that he invoked to explain the fact that pigeons could get back to their home loft when released from a place they'd never been to before. And this eventually became known as true navigation. Now, interestingly, we don't really have a citation for who first coined this term within the field of bird navigation, but one of the most famous laboratory teams working on this, Wolfgang and Rothvita Wilczko, in their 2003 review, noted that it was something that was taken on because this was what we call human sailors' navigation ability that they developed over centuries, and we started to call it true navigation sometime around the 1970s. But what do we mean by true navigation? Well, Don Griffin first noted that birds could actually get home when they were transported outside of an area they'd been to before. So our navigational ability generally involves us being able to learn familiar landmarks and remember places that we've been to before, become familiar with them. Of course, GPS devices now help us to navigate across much larger scales. If I was giving this talk in a lecture theatre, I'd ask you to raise your hand if you thought that if I bundled you onto a plane, flew you 2,000 miles away, kicked you out at the airport and said, okay, find your own way home, would you be able to without any technological needs? Generally, the answer is no. There's always one person who does put their hand up, but generally the answer is no. It's not an ability that we're that familiar with, but many animals, as Don Griffin's homing pigeons being one of the first to be noted to do this, the most complete definition we have is that it's the ability of an animal to return to its original location after displacement to a site in unfamiliar territory. So there's the type 3 navigation, without access to familiar landmarks, goal emanating cues, or information about the displacement route. So what we think that animals that can achieve true navigation can do is work out where they are based solely on cues that they detect at the place they've been displaced to, but those cues are not cues that are anything to do with them having kept track of the displacement. They are completely unfamiliar. There's no familiarity to those cues, and they cannot detect or see anything that emanates from the goal. So they can't do what we call beaconing back to the goal based on following a trail back to the goal. So it's the most spectacular form of navigation, because essentially, to make that more succinct, what it tells us is that animals, if they can do this, are able to calculate their position based on cues that they detect in a place they've never been to before. So this is quite a curious thing. How on earth can animals actually do this? Well, we do have a theory for this. We call it the map and compass theory. And and this was developed in the 1950s based on the discovery that starlings and some other birds were able to orient based on the position of the sun. So we know that birds have what we would call a compass, and we know that they have a sun compass. The sun compass was discovered first in the 1950s. We also subsequently discovered that birds have a star compass, so they can actually work out based on the rotation of stars in the night sky where the point of least rotation is. And in the northern hemisphere, that's north. In the southern hemisphere, the North Star. In the southern hemisphere, that's often the Southern Cross. And then not long around the same time as that, we also discovered that birds can actually sense and detect the Earth's magnetic field and use that as a compass. So we know that birds have compasses. They have this sun compass where they learn the position of the sun across the time of day and link it to their biological clock, the rotation of the night sky, and the magnetic field. But a compass on its own will not tell them where they are. It will tell them where to go when they're trying to get somewhere, but it won't tell them where they are, which is the essence of true navigation, the ability to locate their position in a place they've never been to before and work out what direction they then need to go to get home. And for this, the best idea that we've got is that they actually do something fairly similar to what we do, which is to use some sort of coordinate system. So we call it a bi-coordinate gradient map. So we think that this true navigational map is made up of at least two gradients, two environmental gradients that the birds learn the spatial variation of within some area that's familiar to them. So here I've got the description for a migratory bird. For a homing pigeon, you would just have a familiar area. But for migratory birds have both a breeding area and a winter area. So what we think is that the migratory bird during its first year learns the spatial variation of gradients in the breeding area. And for instance, it notes that gradient A gets stronger as you go north, gradient B gets stronger as you go west. And then it migrates down to its wintering area. It notices as it migrates down. Let's say that for sake of argument, this is a directly south migrating bird. It migrates south along a decreasing gradient A, but during its migratory journey, if it's not displaced, gradient B stays the same. If that bird is then displaced outside of its familiar area and its familiar migratory corridor, what we think it does is it basically extrapolates from the known values that it's learned during its migratory journey and its breeding and wintering time to the new values. So here the animal notes that it has been displaced. It's been displaced to a place where gradient A is the same strength as the breeding area. Gradient B is much stronger than in the breeding area. So that means it must have been displaced west. And if it's trying to migrate down to its wintering area at that point, that would mean it would be heading down towards its goal here in the wintering site. On this return migration, the animal has been displaced outside of its migratory route. So it's been displaced further up the migratory corridor, and it's also been displaced along an eastward gradient because the gradients the gradient is much weaker. So the animal has worked out by extrapolating from the known values to unknown values, it's in a much weaker gradient B, so it must have been displaced east relative to its position and is able to correct. So that's what we think that animals can do in theory. The question is there any evidence that they do this in reality? So when we first started to think about, I say we, when people first started to think about that, I wasn't born, but when people first started to think about what kind of gradients animals could use, such as migratory birds, to actually detect their position on the Earth's surface in this way, the first suggestion was celestial cues. The idea was that because this was how ultimately human navigators had solved the problem of accurate navigation, that birds and other animals that could perform true navigation might do the same. The altitude of the sun varies with latitude. It's lower in the sky the closer you are to the pole, and it's at its highest position at the equator. So in principle, the altitude of the sun could tell you where you are on a latitudinal gradient. And then the final solution of the last solution, sorry, of the navigation problem of finding longitude was solved by humans by having a reference time, having accurate clocks, and having a reference time, which for reasons of history at the time was Greenwich Mean Time, and then having a clock that would be adjusted with local time, and that difference between the global reference time and the local time would tell you your longitudinal position. So this was how humans solved the problems of navigation, using devices such as a sextant to measure height of the stars or the sun, and these accurate clocks. So they thought this must be how birds do this as well. Now, several experiments were done, and the answer is there is no support for the idea that birds, or indeed any other animal, use celestial cues in this way. So there's no evidence that they recognize that the altitude of the sun changes with latitude. And we know this because experiments showing that birds use the sun as a compass, you can actually change the bird's light-dark cycle by keeping them on an artificial light-dark schedule that shifts their body clock, and they react as if when released under the natural conditions, they react to the sun as if the sun is at the position it should be during their shifted time of day. So they wouldn't do that if they could recognize that the sun's height was different. And there's no evidence for any kind of time compensation supporting the idea that birds are using any kind of clock mechanism as a means of positioning their longitude. Okay, there's still some arguments out there that we haven't properly tested the idea that they may have what we call a double clock, but I'm not convinced you would even need a double clock, just an ability to recognize your shifting location. But again, none of the experiments that shift birds' time of day have birds respond in a way that suggests they're responding to a shift in longitude. Conveniently, it has the opposite position of clock shifting for a compass, and all of the artificial shifts of time of day result in the bird responding as if it's using its faulty essentially sun compass. So there's no evidence that celestial cues provide this information, sadly. Otherwise, this would have been quite a short talk. But the other cue that people thought might be an explanation for why how birds could navigate from places they've never been to is the Earth's magnetic field. So the Earth's magnetic field forms several different parameters across the globe, and in places like Europe, quite conveniently, it to some extent almost looks like a latitude-longitude grid. This diagram gets a bit messy, but essentially what you have is three different parameters of the magnetic field. You have the inclination, the angle of the magnetic field lines that they form with the Earth, and they are strongest at the poles and get weaker until they get to zero at the equator. You have the Earth's magnetic field intensity, which similar to inclination are stronger at the poles and is stronger at the poles and weaker as you approach the equator. And then you have something called declination. Declination is the difference between the physical top of the Earth, the geographic North Pole, and the position of the magnetic North Pole, which is not directly underneath the geographical North Pole. So the variation between geographical north and magnetic north in Europe, at least, also across the Atlantic into America, varies with longitudinal position. Now, this doesn't always hold true as you go into Asia, and as you go further east, it becomes a much more complex and convoluted picture, and we'll come back to that later. But nevertheless, the magnetic field was thought to be a cue that animals could use for navigation. But just to kind of briefly depart from what cues and kind of just check that we really are working on something that's a real phenomenon, we need to ask the question, are birds really true navigators? So for a long time, the most convincing evidence that this was true was the famous experiment by A.C. Purdeck, who displaced migratory starlings from Holland down to somewhere near here in Switzerland. And he released them, and he allowed them to carry on migrating and then ringing recaptures over the next several years, I think about 10 years, in fact, started to show him how those birds had responded to that displacement. And what he found was that birds making their first migration, so the juveniles, carried on in the direction they would migrate if they were still on the coast here of the North Sea. They carried on heading in a southwesterly direction and ended up down in Spain and in France. Whereas the adult birds in the filled circles here, they corrected apparently for the displacement. They ended up in their normal breeding areas in Belgium, France, and some of them even in the UK. So what this told Purdeck was that adult birds are able to correct, apparently, for displacements from their normal migratory path, here even much further down below than their normal wintering grounds, whereas juvenile birds making their first migration aren't. So that suggested that adults are able to perform what we would call true navigation. They can correct for a displacement from a place they've never been to before, but the juveniles can't. The juveniles don't have any ability to recognize they've been displaced and don't correct for the displacement. Now, by the definition of true navigation, we wouldn't expect that they should. True navigation is the ability to head back to a known goal, one that you've been to before. So juveniles can't actually correct to go somewhere they've never been to before. There are discussions and arguments, and Caspar Thorup last week, if you saw his talk, presented some examples where juveniles apparently do correct, but in general, the evidence is that juveniles don't have the ability to perform true navigation. On that basis of Purdeck's experiment, you think we would then go on to spend time investigating those cues on migratory birds, but instead, perhaps because the start of this with Don Griffin, work on true navigation switched to a different focus, and that was of our friend, the humble homing pigeon. And homing pigeons became the majority focus of the research on the ability of birds to navigate back from places they've never been to before. If you think about it, this was perhaps not a bad idea. They're a very good model species in as much as they are heading back to a place that you know. Although they can navigate over quite long distances, generally you can take them to places, say 50 or 60 kilometers away from their home loft that they've never been to before. You can control where they have been because you are the one who, can you still hear me okay? My internet connection says it's a bit unstable right now.
Yeah, it's okay. Sometimes you
It's okay.
disappear, but
Okay.
it's okay.
Yeah. I forgot. Okay. In principle, the homing pigeon should be a perfect species for doing these kinds of experiments. We have much more control over where the bird ought to be going than with migratory birds. We don't always know for certain their final migratory destination. And they were able to use techniques such as watching the bird vanish from the release site through binoculars and measure the bearing at which it vanished, which it appears gives you a good measure of homing pigeons' orientation. Often a group of homing pigeons will be oriented towards their home direction as little as 2 or 3 kilometers from release. So it's really a very good model species. And Hans Wallraff, one of the main researchers that has dominated this field, he wrote a book in 2005 summarizing nearly all the research on homing pigeon navigation, arguing that the homing pigeon was a paradigm for understanding this. But what surprised those researching this was that actually a different cue came out as being one of the most important cues, apparently, for homing pigeon navigation. And this was the role of olfactory cues in the ability of homing pigeons to return back to their home loft. A series of experiments done in the early 70s by a group in Pisa in Italy, led by Floriano Papi, but others as well. So Uali, Fiaschi, Silvano Benvenuti, and Boldini. These researchers all continued to work on this for some time. They discovered that if you deprive pigeons of sense of smell before releasing them, then they are unable to return home to their home loft. They did this by numerous different methods, initially by severing the olfactory nerve, by blocking their sense of smell, by stuffing their nasal passages with cotton wool, by using local anesthetic such as xylocaine on the olfactory mucosa, and a substance called zinc sulfate, which actually causes necrosis of the olfactory mucosa tissue. An interesting side story about zinc sulfate is at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, it was being sold as a cold remedy for humans, and people tended to report that it didn't reduce their cold symptoms, but they did lose their sense of smell for a few weeks. It does actually, the tissue does regenerate, so it's a temporary treatment, but more long-lasting than local anesthetic. So what they found was that however they removed the sense of smell, what was consistent was that homing pigeons would fail to return to their home loft. There would be a significantly fewer pigeons with no sense of smell that would return to the home loft than if they had their sense of smell intact. But this started a long-running argument that, to some extent, still rumbles on, although we've moved on a little bit from it. But other people failed to repeat these effects. So both in the United States, in the area around Cornell in Ithaca, and also in Frankfurt in Germany, they failed to repeat the effect of olfactory treatment, and argued perhaps that homing pigeons would use different cues in different places. They argued perhaps that the olfactory cues weren't providing navigational information, but were instead providing some other role, and that this was an intermediate role that they played. However, I was first involved in one of these experiments as a PhD student, and we found that we could repeat the effect. So this lack of an ability to repeat the effect isn't itself consistent. People argued that it was a non-specific role, that removing the sense of smell was simply just a motivational issue. It wasn't providing navigational information, but the sense of smell provided the birds with the motivation to home, and that removing that just meant that they went and perched in a tree and didn't return home. However, and this was one of I guess the last person standing in Pisa is Dr. Anna Gagliardo, and she wrote a review. It's now 50 years of olfactory navigation in birds. This was written over 10 years ago now, but she wrote a review that I would highly recommend reading, summarizing all the research on olfactory navigation on birds. And it's not just the removal of the sense of smell, but there are any number of elegant experiments involving manipulation of the sensory systems and manipulation of the direction at which odors are presented to the birds at the loft, all sorts of different mechanisms by which they investigated this. And they really do provide a very convincing picture that olfactory cues are an explanation for how homing pigeons are able to perform true navigation, return from places they've never been to before. But homing pigeons do not really provide a satisfactory answer to the question I posed at the start, which is really, how do migratory animals that have to migrate over long distances, how are they able to achieve true navigation? Because if you think about it, even those who work on olfactory navigation really did not expect it would be something that could explain the ability of the Arctic tern to go from pole to pole, or as we saw from Caspar Thorup's cuckoos last year, from these cuckoos to go from the very eastern tip of Russia all the way down to Africa, or the wheat ears from Canada down to South Africa. Olfactory cues, they're just not stable enough. The environment is not stable enough to imagine this gradient system that we hypothesize is how true navigation is achieved. And in fact, the Italian group came up with a different explanation for how olfactory cues would work. So one of the things I got interested in, having done a lot of my early work on homing pigeons, was to start to look at this in migratory birds. And this coincidentally was where I first met Caspar. We were both postdoctoral researchers at Princeton University. I'd actually turned up there to work on bats. That's a different story for a different week. But Caspar was fascinated by the Purdeck experiment, and mainly because Caspar was not convinced that starlings were the best subject for this experiment. He argued that the fact that they were social migrants and that they were daytime migrants meant that there could be any number of factors that could have influenced the orientation behavior of the adult and juvenile starlings, and that really the best model species for understanding true navigation in birds were small, solitary migrating songbirds. And so Caspar and myself, alongside Martin Wikelski, who was at Princeton at the time, and others, designed an experiment to mimic Purdeck, although it didn't take us 10 years of ringing recoveries. We managed to do it in 2 weeks because by this time they'd developed technology to allow us to track the birds. We used small radio transmitters. Maybe you can just about make out the antenna on this white-crowned sparrow here. So we caught them in Washington State on the west coast of the United States. We transported them by plane over to New Jersey and released them to see what might happen. We predicted a number of possibilities. They might return, they might just simply reverse the direction they'd been displaced in, head back to their capture site. They might keep heading down, as Purdeck's juveniles had done, towards their normal migratory goal, as if they hadn't been displaced, or they might correct and return to their winter grounds. And what we did find was that juvenile birds that had been making their first ever migratory journey from up here in Alaska down to California, they carried on in the same direction. So juvenile birds, like Purdeck's birds, were actually carrying on in the compass direction. They didn't seem to have recognized they'd been displaced in any way. Adult birds, on the other hand, reacted very differently. They headed off in a direction that was most consistent with number 2 here, the direction towards their winter grounds. One bird, interestingly, actually took off on a night of very heavy winds from the west. It ended up here in Atlantic City, New Jersey, before it then decided the next day in much lighter winds to fly off in the same direction as all the other birds, even though it had been displaced. So Atlantic City is famous for being a place where one of the few places in the US you could gamble. So this one was the one that we called Jack Sparrow, because he went off for a night of gambling in Atlantic City before he decided to migrate back to his winter grounds. So to some extent, to Caspar's surprise, it seemed that Purdeck's experiments were validated by our repeat of this experiment, that birds did show these 2 types of orientation behavior. First-year birds only having a compass direction that they could fly in. A number of experiments had already suggested this was inherited, but our adult birds had this ability to correct for displacements from a 3,000 kilometer displacement here, so much further away than they simply had never been here before. So quite clearly, true navigation is something that does exist. So following on from this, our desire was to find out what cues they could use. And for that kind of a displacement, we thought, well, surely not olfactory cues. But surprisingly, two experiments that we then went on to do did seem to argue that this was the case. So we did an experiment on migrating catbirds, a very similar setup to the experiment on white-crowned sparrows. We displaced them from Illinois over to Princeton, and we had a group that we treated with zinc sulfate, so that was the olfactory treatment, and a group that we treated with a strong magnetic pulse, which was argued to disrupt their sensory system. And what we found was that control birds were able to correct. So from New Jersey, they were heading back towards their winter grounds down here in the on the coast of the US at the Gulf of Mexico. The birds treated with a magnetic pulse also were able to head off in that direction. Birds that had their sense of smell removed, however, they reverted to the population-specific direction as if they hadn't been displaced, which was very similar to the juveniles. So the juveniles actually, remember, don't have a map. They only have a compass. So what this seemed to suggest was in the absence of olfactory cues, the birds no longer had a map to tell them they'd been displaced and reverted to their juvenile-like inherited direction. And then we repeated this on lesser black-backed gulls, which we satellite tracked from Finland down to Africa. And we found a pattern whereby birds with an olfactory sense removed were unable to correct. So here what we show is the distance from the migratory corridor. These are controls. So birds with an olfactory sense removed were less likely to move back towards the migratory corridor, whether displaced east or west. There was some geographical constraints on the west, which meant it was less clear here, but very clearly on the western displacement, we displaced them 1,000 kilometers from their normal migratory route. Birds with a magnetic treatment were able to return. The controls were did not displace in the same way, but all birds with their sense of smell removed did not manage to correct for the displacement. So surprisingly, this olfactory sense seems to be really important even in migratory birds. So at this point, having done this research, my answer to the question, is there really a magnetic map, was probably not. There didn't seem to be any really strong evidence for it. Interestingly, there was very little evidence from homing pigeon experiments that magnetic cues are being used to tell the birds their position. And our experiments on migratory birds also did not really provide any support for a magnetic map. But I then moved on to test this further in migratory birds from Germany. At this point, I'd moved to the Max Planck Institute for Ornithology in Radolfzell, as it was called back then. And I wanted to continue to look at the effect of magnetic pulses on wild birds. And so what we did was we used this magnetic pulse device in which the bird is put inside this coil. There's a very strong magnetic pulse. You wouldn't want to put your credit cards near it. You wouldn't want to stand too near it if you had a pacemaker. It's a very strong magnetic pulse that would remagnetize any magnetic material in sensory cells of the birds. And so we did an experiment where we treated migratory robins that were passing through the Metnau stop over here in Radolfzell. And we treated them with a magnetic pulse, and we found something surprising and slightly interesting here. We found that adult birds treated with a magnetic pulse were much more scattered when they took off. We radio tracked them to find their departure directions. The adults were much more scattered than when treated with a pulse than the controls, which were these open triangles. Whereas the juveniles, the pulse had no effect. Both are more scattered than the adults, but there's no difference between the juvenile groups. And interestingly, we found that that scatter actually was a function of time. Birds that left relatively soon after departure, within about 10 days, were more scattered. This graph shows the residual values compared to the mean. So birds leaving within the first 10 days were much more scattered than birds leaving later. So it seems that eventually they're able to compensate for this treatment. But what this showed was that this magnetic treatment had had an effect on adults, but not juveniles. So what does that mean? Remember, adults have a map. They can perform true navigation. Juveniles only have a compass. They don't perform true navigation. So this, interestingly, did suggest that for our robins here at the Met now, the magnetic treatment had affected potentially a magnetic map. And we wanted to go on and investigate this further, but so far we've been using, as you may have noticed, some rather blunt tools to actually ask these questions. We've been disrupting sensory systems in some rather generic ways, and we don't know exactly what effects they would have. Removal of a sensory system only tells you so much. And at this point, I started a collaboration with Dmitry Kishkinev, who I hired as a postdoc. And Dmitry had been pioneering some techniques for actually doing experiments where you could more precisely manipulate the magnetic field. And for this, he was using the perhaps considered rather old-fashioned technique of using orientation cages, or Emlyn funnels, as they're sometimes called, where birds show a migratory restlessness state. They hop around, they flap around. If you put them in a funnel, they try and escape from that funnel. And actually, their attempts to escape are concentrated in the direction that they would migrate if they were in the wild. So very often the scratches on the funnel are concentrated towards the direction that's consistent with the migratory direction that they would take if they were actually flying. And Dmitry had done an experiment with reed warblers, where he first took them from Rybachi on the Kurish Spit to Zvenigorod near Moscow. And he found that the birds corrected for that displacement, as you would expect them to do, as they had the ability to perform true navigation. He then did something rather clever, which was he didn't take his reed warblers anywhere. He kept them in Rybachi at the Kurish Spit, but he put them inside this device called a Helmholtz coil, which changes the Earth's magnetic field. And he changed the magnetic field parameters to look like Zvenigorod near Moscow, and the birds corrected as they changed their orientation as if they'd been displaced to Zvenigorod. So they responded in exactly the same way as in a physical displacement. So the magnetic field parameters was the only thing that had changed. Excuse me. The birds were still in Rybachi, but based purely on changing the magnetic field and testing them inside this changed magnetic field, the birds changed their orientation. So what we then wanted to do with the grant that we've got funding for was to understand how birds could use these different magnetic parameters. Our first question was, could they use this parameter of declination? Because declination tells them their position on a longitudinal scale. So we did an experiment where we put reed warblers into this Helmholtz coil, tested their orientation, and normally they're heading southwest. The controls headed nicely southwest. What we then did was we changed the difference between magnetic north and geographic north by 8.5 degrees, but keeping the inclination and intensity the same. And what this essentially did was virtually displace them from Rybachi to Scotland, because the same intensity inclination, but 8.5 degrees difference in declination puts them over here in Scotland near Dundee. And what happened was, when we tested the adult birds in that magnetic field, they made a drastic reorientation as if they'd been displaced far from their migratory path. So they had a more than 90-degree rotation of their orientation, from here to here. Juveniles did something slightly interesting, which is one of these curious cases, a bit like some of Casper's experiments, that suggests it's not always as simple as birds don't have a map. the juveniles in this experiment were quite disoriented. So they actually responded as if they'd been confused by this change in declination, whether this was because they had some sort of vestiges of the starts of a map, or whether this was for some other reason we don't know. We need to go on and investigate that more. But what was quite clear here was that declination told the adult birds that they'd been displaced and needed to reorient, and quite drastically reorient, to get back towards their migratory path. But one of the challenges with doing experiments on migratory birds is that any experiment at a single site is always open to criticism, because what they discovered from experiments on homing pigeons is that sometimes certain sites can provide strange results. Sometimes they might provide results where it seems like the birds know which direction to go home, but don't get home. Sometimes they don't seem to know which direction to go home, but actually do get home. So what that told those researching homing pigeon navigation was that the site itself can sometimes influence initial orientation. And for these experiments with migratory birds, the initial orientation is really all we have, because we're not tracking them. We can't yet track them over their entire path. So you need more than one site to do this. So we also wanted to set up a separate site to investigate this in Neusiedlersee in Austria. And in Austria, they have a very nice biological station near the small town called Ilmitz on the Neusiedlersee, and you can catch lots of reed warblers there. And so what we wanted to know from that was, do our birds in Austria show this same response to declination? And as I mentioned earlier, the picture gets more complicated as you go towards the east, because this nice longitudinal pattern of declination, at least on our 2D projection of the Earth's surface, breaks down as you go towards the east, because the Earth's surface is curved, and because declination viewed from the difference between magnetic and geographic north viewed from different places can potentially be the same. There's not such an easy, simple relationship between the magnetic inclination, the magnetic intensity, and the magnetic declination as you go east. So, but nevertheless, we wanted to see whether declination was just being used for these reed warblers which migrate southeast down to East Africa. And so we did an experiment where we repeated what we'd done in Raibachi, only we took them 10 degrees of declination in the opposite direction. Now, this would have taken them over here towards the northwest, at least on our 2D projection of the Earth's surface, but there would have been a lot of uncertainty in exactly where they were on that. And this was also a place they've never been to before, remember. It's well outside of the breeding range of reed warblers, but outside, most of the reed warblers that we capture in Ilmitz have been breeding in Ilmitz. So it's not a place they would have ever been to before. And we did this experiment, and what we found was that the birds did not respond to this change in declination. And perhaps it's not surprising, because what we did was we broke down the spatial relationship, any spatial relationship that they would have learned between the different parameters of the magnetic field. The intensity and inclination remained at the capture site, but the declination broke away from the variation they would have expected to do something different. And that would have given them essentially this cone of uncertainty, depending on which cue they relied on. Intensity goes slightly decreasing south in a southwesterly direction. Inclination is slightly increasing in a southeasterly direction. And then declination is divorced from those here. So perhaps it's not surprising that the birds didn't respond to that strange combination of magnetic parameters that bears no relation to any variation they would have learned during their normal migratory route. Interestingly, another experiment later in Raibachi tried to repeat the results of the reed warblers on robins and on garden warblers, and also found no effect. So the declination cue, having first been shown in reed warblers, was put into question again. We're not totally sure if it's consistent for all birds. But we wanted to go on and work out whether our reed warblers in Ilmits could use magnetic cues at all. Was it that they just simply couldn't use declination in this strange combination that we presented with them, or did they not use magnetic cues in this case? And at this point, a postdoctoral researcher, Florian Packmore, came on board. Florian had been doing work on northern wheatear migratory decisions, but he came on board to work with us on the reed warblers at Ilmits. And what we were quite interested in here was whether our reed warblers not only could use magnetic cues, but could they use magnetic cues that they'd never experienced before? In Dimitri's original experiment, taking birds from Raibachi over to Moscow, to Zvenigorod, although this was a place that was not on their normal migratory route, they were presented with magnetic parameters that they had experienced before, not in that combination, but at different points during their migratory route. They'd seen those values of inclination, they'd seen those values of intensity, and they'd seen those values of declination that they'd seen before during the displacements. So what we wanted to know was if we displaced them to a place where the magnetic cues were of values that were entirely unfamiliar to them, could they actually still correct for that displacement? So what we did was we gave them values of the magnetic field that corresponded to this location here, which is actually a small town in Russia called Neftekamsk. Our collaborator, Nikita Chernetsov, said it's a good job we were able to do this virtually because it's a complete dump. You'd never want to actually go there. So that was quite lucky. But what we found was that when we changed the reed warbler's virtual magnetic field so that it represented this place over here, their orientation changed as if they had been displaced to there. So they could recognize that magnetic field location as telling them that they were displaced far north and west from their normal migratory route, and they corrected for that and corrected for that displacement. And this is far outside their normal breeding and migratory and winter range. So these field parameters really were far outside their normal route. So it does appear that the reed warblers can extrapolate from known to unknown values of the magnetic field. So they're using true navigation based on magnetic field cues to navigate. So what does this mean? Just to sum up, so we find that magnetic map cues extrapolated beyond the familiar magnitudes are experienced during migration can be used to perform true navigation. We have to ask the question, is this really the global cue? Does this, how far can we take those magnetic field values before this system breaks down, if it breaks down at all? Another interesting finding from the discovery is that the finding that declination is sometimes at least a cue for true navigation means that there could be implications for the sensory systems that the birds use. So far, there's evidence that different sensory systems are used in detecting the magnetic field for a compass than are used for detecting it for a map. If the compass is being used essentially as part of the map, so declination is the difference between two compass cues, geographic and magnetic north, that might have implications for how the magnetic field is sensed for the different components of navigation. But also you have to remember the experiments that we did on gulls and on catbirds in the United States. Olfactory cues sometimes appear to play a role in migratory true navigation, and we don't have a good explanation for why those different experiments produce different results. And with that, it just remains for me to thank all the various people that have been involved in these experiments over the years and invite any questions.
Donc, aujourd'hui, on a une présentation faite par le professeur Richard Holland. Donc, il travaille sur la navigation animale, notamment chez les oiseaux. Et donc, la grande question, c'est comment les oiseaux, notamment les oiseaux migrateurs, arrivent à s'orienter. et il s'est intéressé à ce qu'il appelle la navigation vraie. Et alors, comment définir cela? En gros, donc, les oiseaux peuvent utiliser différentes stratégies pour s'orienter. Et par exemple, une stratégie simple, ça pourrait être de simplement garder en mémoire des points de paysage particuliers, comme par exemple des villes, des fleuves, des montagnes. Et en fait, la navigation vraie, c'est justement la capacité d'un animal à retrouver son chemin sans utiliser de repères comme ça terrestres. Et donc, il y a eu plusieurs hypothèses sur justement quel autre indice les oiseaux pouvaient utiliser pour s'orienter et quels étaient donc les mécanismes pour arriver à cela. Et donc, par exemple, on a pensé qu'ils pouvaient utiliser un compas lunaire, c'est-à-dire se repérer par rapport à la position de la Lune dans le ciel, aussi être capable de détecter la position du Soleil ou encore du champ magnétique. Et donc ensuite, si je résume, et donc il y a eu différentes expériences pour notamment tester justement la capacité des oiseaux à s'orienter dans l'espace et à savoir s'ils utilisaient par exemple des indices olfactifs ou des indices magnétiques. Et donc, il y a eu des expériences qui ont été faites, notamment chez les tourneaux. Donc, ça a été par exemple l'expérience de Pederec, où en fait, l'expérience, c'était de déplacer géographiquement des étourneaux euh, dans un endroit où ils n'avaient jamais été et de voir si, lors de la migration, ils arrivaient à se rendre compte en fait de ce déplacement. Donc, ils avaient trouvé qu'ils étaient capables de se rendre compte de ce déplacement. Et, euh, et donc, Richard Holland a voulu un peu reproduire cette expérience-là en utilisant notamment des passereaux aux États-Unis. Et donc, pour étudier la migration vraie, il a utilisé donc il a posé des petits transmetteurs GPS sur un petit passereau, je ne me rappelle plus de l'espèce. Et en fait, il a transporté donc ce passereau de la côte ouest vers la côte est. Donc, c'était un passereau qui normalement euh, habite au niveau de la côte ouest et migre vers le sud. Et en fait, ils l'ont déplacé de la côte est. Donc, c'était un déplacement d'à peu près 3000 kilomètres. Et ils se sont rendus compte que les adultes arrivaient, lorsqu'ils essayaient de migrer, s'ils étaient sur la côte est, ils s'orientaient en direction de l'Est. Donc, ils semblaient avoir réalisé qu'ils avaient été déplacés. Par contre, les juvéniles, donc les jeunes qui réalisent leur première migration, eux, ne faisaient pas cette correction-là. Et ils ont aussi étudié chez une autre espèce d'oiseau les signaux olfactifs, notamment chez les catbirds. Et ils se sont rendus compte que si on coupait chez ces oiseaux les organes olfactifs, eh ben, les adultes, tout comme les juvéniles, ne se rendaient pas compte lorsqu'ils étaient déplacés vers un endroit inconnu, lorsqu'ils voulaient migrer, ils ne se rendaient pas compte qu'ils avaient été déplacés et donc ils allaient dans la mauvaise direction. Et donc, il y a tout un débat autour de l'importance du sens de l'olfaction, notamment chez les oiseaux migrateurs. Ensuite, Richard a présenté un autre type d'expérience où là, on va essayer de modifier un petit peu le champ magnétique pour tester justement la façon dont les oiseaux sont sensibles au champ magnétique. Et donc, pour cela, il y a eu différentes expériences menées donc, qui consistaient, par exemple, à mettre les oiseaux dans une sorte de cage qui modifie en fait le champ magnétique. Et on s'est rendu compte que lorsqu'on faisait ça, les oiseaux migrateurs n'arrivaient plus à s'orienter correctement. Et on pouvait comme ça modifier les paramètres du champ magnétique pour faire croire aux oiseaux qu'ils étaient en fait à un autre endroit du globe. Et les oiseaux, en fait, en prenant en compte ces paramètres magnétiques, s'orientaient comme dans la direction de leur dans la direction initiale en pensant que voilà qu'ils étaient toujours au point théorique où ils devraient être. Je ne sais pas si c'est clair parce que c'est un peu compliqué pour moi. Et du coup, bah voilà en gros ce que j'ai pu retenir. Merci.